I must say that I somehow felt tempted to shelf my little piece for today after I had read the Macron speech and thought it would be interesting to start the conference right away with actually thinking about what that could mean. But I did not shelf my presentation, but I thought we'll have plenty of time, I guess, and opportunities to discuss issues of restitution, repatriation, and provenance. I'll not talk about provenance either, even if I'm one of the co-organizer of one of the 4 conferences on provenance that you've been to in Germany. But I think, again, and there'll be enough time to talk on these issues later. I've had the pleasure to be a member of the advisory board of Heike's exhibition, probably because I co-curated an exhibition on the German colonization of Namibia in 2004, the centenary of the outbreak of the colonial war in Namibia. And that exhibition was opened at the Ethnographic Museum of Cologne in 2004 and traveled to the German Historical Museum in 2005. So that's my background. Being part of the advisory board of the German Historical Museum exhibition made me an interested and committed observer of the exhibition project, in particular of its reception. After leafing through the visitor book with its drastic comments, I was eager to better understand how the visitors of the exhibition, who the visitors were, and what had brought them to the exhibition. And as Heike has argued, the motivation of visitors is often not revealed in the visitor book, so I wanted to particularly get at that. This is why I ventured into the field of visitor research via interviews in order to be able to ask for such motivations. Admittedly, I did this without any experience in this field, but rather with what my colleague Christine Gerbich, an experienced museum educator, would call a quick and dirty approach. The core of the research were 31 or semi-structured interviews with visitors after their visit. My sample was not representative, it was not randomized. To the contrary, I sometimes just picked people I thought would have interesting stories to tell. So in a way, it was a very biased approach. And the next 5 minutes, I'll summarize some of my impressions. I should say in advance that, interestingly, none of the very critical, let alone the dismissive or racist visitors that had inscribed themselves into the visitor book crossed my path. So even if visitors interviewed by me were critical of the scenography of the way or the way information was presented, they appreciated the museum's effort to talk about colonialism with a critical voice. That does not relativize the contestedness that could be seen in the visitor book comments. It's, in my view, rather a result of the method or my approach. So I think that also needs maybe further reflection with which approach or method in visitor research do you get which sort of reactions or feedbacks from visitors. At any rate, the, let's say, positive response of my interviewees correlated with some broader observations that Heike already mentioned as well. For example, that people seemed to stay for very long in the exhibition. Some had come for a second visit. There were hardly any what I would call butterflies, people that do a 20 minutes tour of an exhibition. Many visitors were committed readers, as you can see in this image. And the exhibition was often rarely crowded. So as Heike said, 140,000 was a quite considerable number for the museum. Museum educators reported that the visitorship had been more heterogeneous and diverse than usual, including a substantial number of young people. The picture that I got from the interviews I did with 1 or 2 persons or even a group was the following. Apart from 4 people or groups of people who had happened upon the exhibition, all interviewees gave very clear reasons why they had chosen to come to the exhibition, to come to this exhibition. I'll start with the most fundamental reason, that people felt they had either not enough knowledge about colonialism at all, or not good enough an overview of colonial history. Some related their own lack of knowledge on German memory, on colonialism, to German memory culture, characterizing colonialism as a neglected chapter in German history. And that already came out in Heike's talk as well. In particular, in the face of a rather intensive dealing with the Holocaust in German memory culture. Others articulated an explicit interest in post-colonial issues, in critical perspectives on globalization, and in international cooperation, for example. Also, a series of professional interests were articulated. For example, very typically, a history teacher came to the exhibition who regularly makes discussions on colonialism part of his classes on human rights issues. So I think it would be interesting to also ask how exactly colonialism is dealt with in German curricula at this moment. And there is differences between the different Bundesländer. I know, for example, in North Rhine-Westphalia, where I come from, it seems to be part of the curriculum. That's what I was taught by teachers. And in other parts and regions, it seems to be not. Some of the visitors had educational purposes in mind when they came. For example, two students who worked as babysitters took the children of a couple who prepared for a job in Myanmar to the exhibition in order to raise the children's awareness to stereotypes and prejudices against people from other cultural backgrounds. I found this a nice example because it makes clear how indeed many people really used the exhibition for their own ends and purposes. And that, to me, was very interesting. A very intense way of using the information, the critical view laid out in the exhibition for their own interests and projects in their lives. The most individual motivations seem to be biographical connections to colonial history. They were mentioned more often than any other reason. Some of these connections were of a general kind, for example, that people had a black German or black Swiss background and hence articulated a concern with the history of racism. So that did come out in my interviews, while, as Heike said in the visitor book, that perspective is not very present, but I think that depends obviously on the medium in which people articulate themselves. And the visitor book obviously is not so much a medium where these visitors felt they would want to articulate their views. Others pointed to their particular family history. For example, a father and a son, a great-grandson and great-great-grandson of Theodor Leutwein, governor of German Southwest Africa, were spending a weekend together, digging deeper into their family history. And that's why then they came to the exhibition. But they did that as well from a critical perspective. The great-grandson of a chiefly family in Tanzania who had resisted the Germans wanted to do his father a Berliner since many decades, and a genealogist and ethnic historian, as he called him, wanted to do his father a favor and took him to the exhibition. This brings me to my last point, international global visitors. As Heike already mentioned, people referenced the memory cultures in their own countries of origin very often, characterizing in most cases the exhibition as a shining example, so to say. In this context, the most impressive example was a woman from Bristol who had a British mother and a Ghanaian father and was part of an NGO who raises awareness for Africa as a venue and Africans as victims in the First World War. She spent 3 days in a row in the exhibition taking notes and involving other visitors in discussions. However, for me, the most interesting interviews were those in which people brought their knowledge of colonialism in other regions of the world, that we usually do not think of in this context in Germany to the exhibition and made comparisons. A young South Korean car designer, for example, reflected upon the fact that the exhibition provided plenty of African names on German documents. She was surprised because, to her knowledge, South Korean names had been forbidden during Japanese annexation. And a young Japanese artist and dancer reflected upon the fact that Japanese art academies had only taught him Western-style art, and wondered how to interpret this phenomenon against the background of colonialism and global power asymmetries. Many of the above-mentioned examples showed how people narrated, I quote from Philip Shark's book on Te Papa, how people narrated their biographies into the museum experience and the museum experience into their biographies, unquote. While my initial impression of the visitor book had been that it contained much less remarks by people with biographical connections to colonialism than, for example, the visitor book of our exhibition on Namibia in 2004, the interviews showed that this was not exactly the case. Even though direct genealogical links, so to say, existed only in a few cases, indeed less than, for example, in 2004, when people wrote into that, the Namibia exhibition visitor book, people still did understand, or those whom I interviewed, as part of a post-colonial world, and used the exhibition to think through their positionality in that world. So I think that does speak to the question that you raised: how is life in the afterlife of colonialism, and how people thought about that. This last observation, I think, could now make a wonderful bridge to broader questions like where things stand at the moment in the current debate on colonialism in Germany. And Heike already mentioned a couple of points, but for reasons of time, I'll leave it at this little anecdotal report or appendix to Heike's talk, and we may reflect upon the broader questions in the discussion. Thank you very much.